Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Now, today we're going to be taking a look at someone who's a pretty big name in political thought,
Hmm.
but we're going to be looking at them through a very specific lens.
Okay.
That lens is India,
Interesting.
and the thinker is John Stuart Mill.
Ah,
So John Stuart Mill, a huge name in liberalism and ideas about liberty and individual rights.
yeah, you think of like On Liberty and
Exactly, all of his
famous.
big works.
But today we're going to be focusing on a paper that looks at his writings about India
Okay.
and how his ideas about liberty played out when he was thinking about the very complex situation in colonial India.
Yeah, that's really fascinating because obviously there's a tension there, right? You
Yes.
have somebody who is known for advocating for freedom, individual rights,
Right.
and then you have the context of colonialism, which is obviously the opposite of that.
Yeah, it's like the ultimate case study of,
Correct.
well, how do these ideas actually work out when
Absolutely.
you are faced with people who you don't believe are capable of ruling themselves? Exactly. And that's where the Eurocentrism of the time period really comes into play.
Okay, so let's talk about that. So what did John Stuart Mill actually believe about India?
Well, so he argued that India, despite its very rich and glorious past, was in a state of stagnation.
Okay.
And he went so far as to say that India needed benevolent despotism from a more advanced civilization.
Benevolent despotism.
Yeah.
Those two words don't really seem like they go together.
Right. It's like a bit of an oxymoron.
Yeah.
But for Mill, he saw this as kind of a necessary evil
Okay.
for India to progress and eventually be able to govern itself.
He saw British rule as like a temporary but necessary,
Exactly.
like a stepping stone.
Yeah, a kind of paternalistic approach.
So kind of like India needs a strong but kind ruler in the form of Britain.
Precisely. And you see this kind of thinking reflected in other thinkers of the time as well.
Like who?
Like Hegel, like Marx, they all viewed European civilization as this pinnacle of progress.
Okay.
And so other societies needed to be brought up to that level.
Wow. So, I mean, this is already raising so many questions for me. If John Stuart Mill was such a champion of liberty, like how could he justify this type of paternalistic approach to India? Wouldn't that go against, like, the core of what he believed in?
Yeah, and that's the fascinating thing about studying intellectuals and their ideas.
Yeah.
Often there are contradictions and inconsistencies, and trying to unpack those,
Right.
trying to understand how they reconcile these seemingly contradictory positions is part of what makes it so interesting.
Especially when you're thinking about something like international relations.
Absolutely.
You know, for people who are interested in this for the UPSC, this is like
What's a perfect example?
a key concept.
Yeah, and you even see in this paper they talk about an Indian reformer by the name of Ramohun Roy
Okay.
who advocated for a different approach. He actually wanted the British Parliament to rule India directly.
Interesting. So he's saying like even Indians
How?
believe that like British rule was needed?
Well, he felt that India at that particular time was incapable of carrying out the kind of social reforms that he thought were necessary.
Oh, wow. That's a really interesting wrinkle to add to this conversation.
Yeah, and it just goes to show there were so many different perspectives
Yeah.
at play during this time.
And how complex the situation was.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we've established that Mill, you know, he had some pretty strong and some might say controversial ideas about India's capacity for self-rule. So let's dig a little deeper into what his stance was on social reform within India.
Okay.
What did he actually have to say about that?
So this is where it gets really interesting. He was opposed to any kind of direct interference in religious practices, even those that were considered barbaric by Western standards.
Okay.
However, at the same time, he also strongly advocated for abolishing certain practices like sati.
Wait, so he's against interfering with religious practices, but wants to abolish sati. How does he reconcile those two ideas?
Yeah, it's a bit of a head scratcher. He saw sati as a clear violation of basic human rights that transcended cultural boundaries.
Okay.
And so for him,
So human rights were above
exactly.
cultural relativism
Yeah.
to a certain extent.
And this is a debate that continues to this day, right? Like, what is the role of intervention
Yeah.
when it comes to another society's customs and traditions?
Especially when you're thinking about the history of colonialism and post-colonial societies.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
So, you know, we're talking about this idea of cultural relativism, which I think is an important thing to define just for our listeners who might not be familiar with the term.
Sure.
So what does cultural relativism actually mean?
So cultural relativism is the idea that you should understand a person's beliefs, values, practices
Right.
through the lens of their own culture
Okay.
and not judge them based on the standards of another culture.
Gotcha.
So it acknowledges that what's considered right or wrong can vary significantly from one culture to another.
Okay, so Mill was clearly grappling with this idea, trying to figure out how to balance respect for Indian culture with his own beliefs about what was right and wrong.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about religious practices either.
Yeah.
He also had some interesting views on education.
Okay, how so?
Well, while he was a strong advocate for education, he was actually critical of how the British imposed English language and culture on India.
Oh, so he wasn't a fan of just like taking the Western system and just like plopping it onto...
Exactly. He didn't think that was the right approach.
Okay.
He believed in spreading Western ideas,
Okay.
but through Indian languages,
Oh, interesting.
so that the Indian people could engage with those ideas on their own terms.
He thought that would lead to more sustainable change.
Exactly. More organic, more respectful.
Yeah, and when you think about it through the lens of, people who are studying colonialism and cultural exchange and, the dynamics of power,
It's a really important point.
it's a really fascinating insight.
Yeah, he's not just saying, let's impose our values. He's saying, let's have a dialogue, a cultural exchange,
Which is a very different
much more nuanced.
approach.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's very relevant for, those of you who are studying for the UPSC and thinking about, how do you approach these historical events?
hmm
What are the theoretical frameworks that you can use to understand them?
It's really important to look at the nuances of these ideas
Absolutely.
and to understand the complexities of the historical situation.
Yeah, not just accept things at face value,
Right.
but really dig deep and think critically.
So we've talked about his ideas about, self-rule and about social reform.
Yeah.
But there's another area where Mill's ideas get really interesting, and that's his perspective on women's rights.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
And that's what we're going to pick up next time on the deep dive.
So this is where, Mill's thinking gets a little bit complicated
Okay.
because while he was a huge advocate for gender equality
Mm-hmm.
in the West,
Right.
he even wrote, The Subjection of Women.
He literally wrote the book on it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when it came to India, his views were a little bit different.
Okay.
He didn't believe that Asian societies were ready for the same level of individual liberty.
So he's saying, like, women should have equal rights
In Europe,
in Europe,
yeah,
but not in India.
not necessarily in India.
Okay.
He still saw Asian societies as less developed.
So that Eurocentrism that we were talking about before,
It kind of creeps back in.
yeah, it's like it's pervasive,
Yeah.
even in his ideas about something like gender equality.
Unfortunately, yeah. And I think this is a good reminder that when we study these thinkers,
Yeah,
we have to remember the context that they were writing in.
absolute.
And we can't judge them by today's standards,
Right.
but we have to understand, how their ideas were shaped by the prevailing attitudes of their time.
Yeah, I mean, this is a perfect example of that.
Exactly.
And it's something that, for those of you studying for the UPSC,
Yeah,
it's really important to keep in mind.
absolutely.
You can't just take these ideas at face value.
You have to understand where they're coming from and how they've evolved over time.
Okay, so the paper also mentions an Indian thinker,
Yes.
Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. What did he have to say about this whole issue of women's rights?
So Chatterjee actually agreed with Mill on the principle of gender equality,
Okay.
but he argued that Indian women faced even greater levels of subjugation
Interesting.
compared to their European counterparts.
So he's kind of like, taking Mill's ideas
Yeah,
and like applying them to the Indian context.
precisely. And saying, look, you're right about this in principle, but the situation in India
Is even worse.
is far more dire. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important trend that we see with a lot of Indian thinkers at this time. They're engaging with these Western ideas, but they're also challenging them
Okay.
and adapting them based on their own experiences and the realities of Indian society.
That critical thinking, I feel like, is really important
Oh, it's essential.
for the UPSC. Like, you can't just be memorizing facts and figures.
Yes.
You have to be able to
Think for yourself.
think critically.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so this is all really fascinating stuff, and
Mhm.
it really shows how, Western political thought intersects with
Mhm.
Indian history and contemporary issues.
And how those ideas were debated and contested at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about Mill's broader legacy,
Okay.
and specifically his contributions to revising utilitarianism.
Yeah.
Now, utilitarianism for me has always been a little bit of a tricky concept.
Okay.
Could you maybe give us like a quick breakdown of what it is and how May kind of changed it?
Sure. So utilitarianism at its core is the idea that the best action is the one that produces the greatest happiness
Okay.
for the greatest number of people.
So the greatest good for the greatest number.
Exactly.
Right.
But Mill kind of took that idea and expanded on it.
Okay.
He said, simply maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain isn't enough. We also need to consider individual liberty.
Interesting.
He believed that individual freedom was essential
Okay.
for human flourishing.
So it's not just about like the collective happiness.
Right.
It's also about individual rights.
Exactly.
Okay, that's a really important distinction.
And one that's very relevant to our discussion about India.
Yeah, how so?
Well, Mill was worried about what he called the tyranny of the majority.
Oh, I've heard that phrase before.
Yeah, so he's basically saying that if a society is solely focused on collective happiness,
Mm-hmm.
the majority could end up suppressing the rights of the minority.
Right.
And that's something that's, incredibly relevant to understanding the challenges of democracy.
Especially in a diverse country like India.
Absolutely.
So even though Mill's views on India's capacity for self-rule were, problematic at best,
Mm-hmm.
his broader philosophical contributions, like his emphasis on individual liberty and his warnings about the tyranny of the majority,
Right.
are still very relevant
Absolutely.
for understanding India's journey as a democratic nation.
And for understanding the challenges that democracies face all over the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The paper even draws a really interesting parallel between Mill's anxieties about the tyranny of the majority and the challenges faced by post-colonial societies like India.
Yeah, it's a brilliant connection.
Well,
because even though he was writing in the context of 19th century Europe,
Mm-hmm.
his ideas resonate really deeply with the experiences of newly independent nations.
Who are trying to figure out
Exactly how to balance individual rights
Yeah.
with the needs of the state.
the collective good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like we're seeing these historical figures come to life,
Mm-hmm.
not just as names in a textbook,
Right.
but as thinkers whose ideas are still shaping
Yeah.
the world that we live in.
And the debates that we're having.
Exactly.
And for you, as you're preparing for the UPSC,
Mm-hmm.
that understanding of historical context and the evolution of ideas
Yeah.
is absolutely crucial.
It's not just about rote memorization.
No.
It's about understanding the complexities.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of really big ideas here today, from Mill's Eurocentric views on India
Mm-hmm.
to his complex stance on social reform
Yeah.
and his contributions to liberal thought.
And his warnings about the tyranny of the majority.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
for our listeners who are deep in their UPSC preparations, what are some key takeaways that they should keep in mind when they're thinking about John Stuart Mill?
I think the biggest takeaway is that, when we study these thinkers, it's not about agreeing with everything they said.
Right.
It's about understanding, their ideas within their historical context,
Mm-hmm.
analyzing their strengths and their weaknesses,
Yeah.
and seeing how they connect to broader themes
Right.
in international relations and political thought.
So it's not just about memorizing,
Yeah, dates and names.
dates and names and facts.
Right. It's about developing that critical understanding of
Yeah.
how these ideas have shaped the world. And I think Mill, despite, some of his problematic views,
Yeah.
does offer some valuable insights.
Okay, like what?
Well, his emphasis on individual liberty,
Mm.
his warnings about the tyranny of the majority,
Yeah.
his belief in the power of education,
Right.
these are all concepts that are still relevant
Mm-hmm.
to the challenges that we face today.
Yeah, I mean, I think this deep dive has really highlighted how, seemingly abstract
Mm-hmm.
philosophical ideas can actually have
Yeah,
really practical implications for how we understand
absolutely.
the world.
Yeah, they're not just ivory tower concepts. They
Right.
have real world impact.
And especially for, people who are going to be diplomats,
Yes, future policymakers.
policymakers, people who are shaping
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
world.
That ability to connect theory to practice
Yes.
is essential.
It's like we've been given a new lens
Mhm.
to view the world.
Yeah, a new way of thinking about these issues.
One that lets us see the historical roots of contemporary debates.
Absolutely.
About development and intervention and cultural relativism.
And the balance between individual rights
Yes.
and the collective good.
all of those things are so interconnected.
Yeah, and Mill was grappling with all of those issues
Right.
back in the 19th century.
And even though his answers, may not be satisfactory to us today,
Mm-hmm.
The fact that he was wrestling with these questions
Yeah.
gives us a framework for thinking about them.
Exactly. And it reminds us that these are ongoing debates.
Yeah, it's not like there's a simple answer.
No.
So to wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a final question.
Okay.
How can we learn from both Mill's insights and his blind spots to create a more just and equitable world order?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
And it's one that as future leaders and thinkers, you'll be wrestling with throughout your careers.
Yeah.
But that's what makes studying international relations so fascinating.
Yeah.
It challenges us to think critically, to question assumptions, and to strive for a better world.
And on that note, if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity,
Yes.
we encourage you to subscribe to our channel.
Hit that like button.
Hit that like button. Share this episode with your fellow UPSC warriors.
Absolutely.
Keep those conversations going because the quest for knowledge is definitely a journey best shared.
Couldn't agree more.
Until next time, keep diving deep, keep questioning, and keep striving for a better world.